Billionaire buys an abandoned mansion and discovers that the young woman hiding there was the kidnapped heiress of the estate. David Lanson, an eccentric billionaire, decided to buy and restore an old abandoned mansion, infamous for its mysteries. But on his very first night, he heard crying coming from the basement and found a frightened young woman holding a baby. The woman, named Emily, refused to explain how she ended up there, but her eyes were filled with fear and despair. Determined to uncover the truth, David investigated and made a shocking discovery. Emily was the rightful heiress of the mansion, kidnapped years ago so her fortune could be stolen. Now David not only had to protect her from a deadly threat, but also unravel the dark secrets surrounding the estate before it was too late. David Lanson stood before the wrought iron gates of Ravencrest Manor, his steel gray eyes studying the decrepit mansion that loomed against the autumn sky. At 42, he had amassed enough wealth to buy small countries, yet something about this particular property called to him in a way that transcended mere financial investment. The Victorian architecture, though weathered by decades of neglect, retained an aristocratic dignity that seemed to whisper of forgotten stories. "Mr. Lanson, are you certain about this purchase?" Henry Matthews, his real estate agent, shuffled nervously beside him. "The property has quite a reputation." David's lips curved into a slight smile. "The reputation is precisely what interests me, Henry." He ran his fingers along the rusted gate, leaving trails in the dust. 20 years of abandonment, mysterious disappearances, and local legends. It's exactly the kind of project I've been looking for. The late October wind whipped through the overgrown grounds, carrying dead leaves in spiral patterns across the cracked driveway. The mansion's windows stared back at them like hollow eyes, some broken, others clouded with decades of grime. The once magnificent gardens had become a twisted jungle of thorny vines and wild roses, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. As they walked the grounds, David's Italian leather shoes crunching on gravel and dead leaves, Henry continued his nervous commentary. "The last owners, the Blackwood family, they just vanished, left everything behind. Some say it was financial trouble, others claim—" "I've read all the reports, Henry," David interrupted gently. "The official investigation found no evidence of foul play. The family simply disappeared, leaving behind a fortune in antiques and a property that's been tied up in legal limbo ever since." They reached the grand entrance where twin lion statues guarded massive oak doors. David produced an ancient brass key from his coat pocket. The lock mechanism protested with a screech of metal on metal, but eventually yielded. The foyer beyond was a testament to faded grandeur. Dust motes danced in shafts of light that penetrated the dirty windows, illuminating a sweeping staircase and crystal chandelier. Sheets draped over furniture created ghostly silhouettes in the dim light. "The electrical system will need complete replacement," David mused, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Plumbing too, but the bones are solid. Victorian craftsmanship at its finest." Henry watched as his client moved through the space with the confidence of someone already home. "The local historical society has expressed interest in preserving—" "I intend to restore it," David said firmly. "Every detail, every fixture, every piece of molding. This place deserves to live again." They spent the next 2 hours touring the mansion's 3 floors. David took meticulous notes on his phone, occasionally stopping to photograph particularly interesting architectural details or pieces of furniture hidden under dusty sheets. The library especially captured his attention. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, lined with leather-bound volumes, spoke of generations of collected knowledge. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its marble mantel carved with intricate scenes from classical mythology. The Blackwoods were quite the collectors, David observed, running a finger along book spines. "First editions, rare manuscripts. This library alone is worth millions." As the afternoon light began to fade, they made their way back to the foyer. David's expression was decisive as he turned to Henry. "Draw up the papers. I'll take it as is, including all contents." "But sir, we haven't even discussed the basement level or the—" "I'll explore those areas on my own time." David's tone brooked no argument. "Have the documents ready tomorrow. I want to begin work immediately." After Henry departed, David remained in the foyer, listening to the settling sounds of the old house. Despite its state of abandonment, there was something alive about the place, something that seemed to pulse beneath its dusty surface. He had made billions in tech startups, but this was different. This was about preservation, about breathing life back into something beautiful that the world had forgotten. As darkness fell, David reluctantly prepared to leave. But before he reached the door, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable, the cry of a baby, echoing from somewhere deep within the mansion's depths. He stood frozen, straining to hear. The cry came again, followed by what sounded like a woman's hushing sounds. The noises were coming from below, the basement Henry had mentioned. David's heart pounded as he pulled out his phone's flashlight. Common sense said he should call the police, but something held him back. The same instinct that had made him a successful businessman now told him to investigate personally. He found the basement door hidden beneath the main staircase. It opened with a protesting groan, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The beam of his flashlight caught cobwebs and ancient wine racks as he carefully made his way down. The crying grew louder, more distinct. Then suddenly the light fell upon a shocking scene. A young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, cradling an infant in her arms. She sat on a makeshift bed of old blankets surrounded by evidence of habitation, empty food containers, water bottles, basic supplies. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. She clutched the baby closer, pressing herself against the wall. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't hurt us." David stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his mind racing to process the scene before him. The young woman's face was gaunt, her clothes threadbare, but there was an undeniable elegance to her features that spoke of better days. "I'm not here to hurt you," David said softly, lowering his phone to dim the harsh light. "My name is David Lanson. I just purchased this house." The woman's eyes widened further, a mix of fear and disbelief crossing her face. "Purchased? But that's impossible. This house belongs to..." She cut herself off, biting her lip as if she'd said too much. David took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "What's your name? How long have you been down here?" She hesitated, her gaze darting between David and the stairs behind him, as if calculating an escape route. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily. My name is Emily." The baby in her arms began to fuss, and Emily instinctively rocked it, her maternal instincts overriding her fear for a moment. David noticed how naturally she held the child. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the squalid conditions, "Emily," David said gently, "you're safe now. I can help you, but I need to understand what's going on. Why are you hiding in this basement?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. I can't tell you. They'll find us. They'll take her away." David's mind raced. Who were they? And why did Emily seem so terrified of being discovered? He knew he needed to proceed carefully, to gain her trust without pushing too hard. "Okay," he said, taking a seat on the bottom step to appear less threatening. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but it's not safe for you or the baby down here. There's no heat, no proper sanitation. Let me at least get you upstairs where it's warmer." Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking between David and the baby. You won't call anyone?" "The police or..." "Not without your permission," David assured her. "Right now, I just want to make sure you and the baby are okay." After a long moment, Emily nodded. David helped her to her feet, noticing how she swayed slightly from weakness. He supported her as they climbed the stairs, emerging into the grand foyer that now seemed surreal in contrast to the grim basement. David led them to the library, where plush armchairs still sat covered in dust sheets. He quickly uncovered two, gesturing for Emily to sit. She sank into the chair gratefully, cradling the now sleeping infant. "I'll be right back," David said, his mind already planning next steps. Just going to grab some supplies from my car." He returned minutes later with bottled water, energy bars, and a first aid kit. As Emily drank thirstily, David took the opportunity to study her more closely. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at his memory. "Emily," he said carefully, "I know you're scared, but I need to ask. Are you connected to this house somehow? To the Blackwood family?" The water bottle slipped from Emily's hand, spilling across the hardwood floor. Her face had gone pale, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. How do you know that name?" she whispered. David's suspicions crystallized. "Because I researched this property extensively before buying it. The Blackwoods were the last known owners before they disappeared 20 years ago." "Emily, are you related to them?" Emily's shoulders slumped, as if a great weight had settled upon her. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "Related, Mr. Lanson, I am Emily Blackwood. The house, the estate, it should all be mine." The revelation hit David like a physical blow. His mind raced through the implications. If Emily was telling the truth, it meant the young woman before him was the missing heiress to a vast fortune, a woman who had been presumed dead for 2 decades. "But that's impossible," David stammered. "You'd have been just a child when the family disappeared." Emily nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was 8 years old. Old enough to remember, but too young to understand. They told everyone we'd died in an accident overseas, but the truth..." She trailed off, her eyes haunted. David leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Emily, what happened? Who took you?" She shook her head vehemently. "I can't. It's not safe. They're still out there, still watching. If they know I'm here, that I've had a baby..." Emily clutched the infant closer, her knuckles white. David's mind whirled with questions, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate needs. "Okay, we don't have to talk about everything right now. But Emily, you need proper food, medical care. The baby needs to be checked by a doctor." Fear flashed across Emily's face. "No doctors. No one can know we're here. Please, Mr. Lanson, you don't understand what they're capable of." David held up his hands placatingly. "All right, no doctors for now. But at least let me get you some proper food and supplies. You can't keep living in that basement." Emily bit her lip, clearly torn between her desperate need for help and her ingrained fear. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but please, be careful. Don't let anyone see you buying things for a woman and baby." As David prepared to leave, a thought struck him. "Emily, what's the baby's name?" A ghost of a smile touched Emily's lips as she looked down at the sleeping infant. "Hope. Her name is Hope." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with significance. David nodded, a surge of protectiveness washing over him. Whatever dark forces had stolen Emily's childhood, whatever secrets lurked in the shadows of Ravencrest Manor, he was now irrevocably involved. As he drove into town, David's mind raced. He needed to tread carefully. If Emily's story was true, there were powerful people who had gone to great lengths to keep her hidden. He couldn't go to the authorities, not without putting Emily and Hope in danger. But he couldn't simply ignore the situation either. He made several stops, buying diapers, formula, clothing, and other essentials. At a small diner, he ordered a variety of takeout meals, enough to last a few days. As he waited for the food, he pulled out his phone and began researching, diving deeper into the Blackwood family history than he had before. The official story was tragic but straightforward. Gregory and Victoria Blackwood, along with their young daughter Emily, had supposedly perished in a boating accident while vacationing in the Mediterranean. Bodies were never recovered, but given the circumstances, death certificates were issued after an appropriate period. But now, armed with the knowledge that Emily was alive, David began to see the holes in the narrative. The timing of the accident coincided with several large withdrawals from Blackwood family accounts. There were inconsistencies in witness statements, and the investigation seemed to have been closed with unusual haste. By the time David returned to Ravencrest Manor, his car laden with supplies, he had formed a chilling hypothesis. The Blackwood disappearance hadn't been an accident or a tragedy. It had been a carefully orchestrated kidnapping, designed to seize control of the vast Blackwood fortune. As he entered the library, David found Emily dozing in the armchair, Hope cradled protectively in her arms. The scene tugged at his heart, a stark reminder of the human cost behind the cold facts he'd been researching. Emily stirred as David set down the bags of supplies, her eyes instantly alert and wary. It was a stark reminder of the years she must have spent looking over her shoulder, never truly safe. "I brought food, clothes, and some things for the baby," David said softly, careful not to startle her further. "There's a guest room upstairs that should be more comfortable than the basement. Why don't you get cleaned up and changed while I heat up some dinner?" Gratitude and suspicion warred on Emily's face. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know me." David considered his words carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I think you're in real danger, Emily. I've been doing some research, and the official story about your family's disappearance doesn't add up." Emily's face paled, but she nodded. "It never did. But the truth is so much worse than you can imagine." "I want to help you, Emily," David said earnestly. "But to do that, I need to understand what we're up against. Who are you hiding from?" Emily looked down at Hope, gently stroking the baby's cheek. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My uncle, my father's younger brother, Charles Blackwood, he orchestrated everything." David's mind raced, fitting this new piece into the puzzle. Charles Blackwood had been the one to handle the estate after the family's disappearance, citing distant cousin status. He'd liquidated much of the Blackwood holdings before seemingly vanishing himself a few years later. "Your uncle kidnapped your entire family?" David asked, struggling to keep the shock from his voice. Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He was always jealous of my father's success, of the Blackwood legacy. He had connections, dangerous ones. They made it look like an accident, but they took us to a remote compound. My parents..." Her voice broke. "They didn't survive the first year." David's heart ached for the young woman before him, for the child she had been. "Emily, I'm so sorry. But how did you escape?" A bitter smile crossed Emily's face. "I didn't, not really. As I got older, they loosened the security. I think they planned to use me to access what was left of the Blackwood fortune once I came of age. But then I found out I was pregnant." She trailed off, hugging Hope closer. David could fill in the blanks. A desperate escape, a return to the only home she had ever known, hiding in fear for months. "Emily," David said gently, "we need to go to the authorities. With your testimony..." "No." Emily's vehemence startled the baby, who began to fuss. She rocked Hope gently, lowering her voice. "You don't understand. My uncle, the people he works with, they have connections everywhere. Police, judges, politicians. I don't know who I can trust." David ran a hand through his hair, frustration warring with his desire to help. "Okay, no authorities for now, but we need a plan. You can't hide here forever, and I technically don't even own this place if you're alive." A look of panic crossed Emily's face. "Please don't make us leave. This is the only safe place I know." "I'm not going to throw you out," David assured her quickly. "But we need to think long-term. Your uncle, these people he works with, they're still out there. And if they realize you're alive..." Emily nodded, her expression grim. "They'll come for us. For Hope." David's protective instincts surged. In the span of a few hours, his life had become inextricably entwined with Emily and her daughter. He couldn't walk away now, couldn't pretend he hadn't uncovered this web of corruption and violence. "All right," he said, his tone decisive. "First things first. You both need rest and proper meals. We'll get you settled in the guest room, and tomorrow we can start figuring out our next steps." As David showed Emily to the guest room, His mind was already formulating plans. He had resources, connections of his own. There had to be a way to bring Emily's uncle to justice without putting her and Hope at risk. Later that night, after ensuring Emily and Hope were comfortable, David sat in the library surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and financial records he'd found in the house. The more he dug, the more convinced he became that the conspiracy around the Blackwood disappearance went far beyond just Charles. There were hints of money laundering, of connections to organized crime. The Blackwood fortune hadn't just been stolen, it had been used to fuel a vast criminal enterprise. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, David finally allowed himself a few hours of restless sleep. He dreamed of shadowy figures pursuing a young girl through endless corridors, of a baby's cry echoing through an empty mansion. He awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet conversation from the kitchen. For a moment, disoriented, he thought he was back in his penthouse in the city. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and he hurried to make himself presentable. In the kitchen, he found Emily attempting to cook breakfast one-handed while balancing Hope on her hip. The domesticity of the scene was at odds with the gravity of their situation, but David couldn't help but smile. "Here, let me help," he offered, gently taking Hope from Emily. The baby regarded him solemnly for a moment before breaking into a toothless grin. As they worked together to prepare a simple meal, David felt a sense of purpose settling over him. This wasn't just about solving a mystery or righting a wrong anymore. It was about protecting this small, fragile family that fate had placed in his path. Over breakfast, David shared what he had uncovered during his night of research. Emily listened intently, her face a mix of fear and determination. "So it's not just my uncle," she said softly. "It's an entire network." David nodded grimly, "Which makes this more dangerous, but also gives us more angles to work with. If we can find a weak link, someone willing to turn on the others." Emily's hand shook as she set down her coffee cup. "It's too risky. These people, they don't hesitate to eliminate threats. If they find out I'm alive, that I have a child, I won't let that happen," David said firmly, surprising himself with the intensity of his conviction. "Emily, I know we've only just met, but I promise you, I will do everything in my power to keep you and Hope safe." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and for a moment David thought he had overstepped. But then she reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been alone for so long I'd almost forgotten what it feels like to have someone on my side." As they cleared the breakfast dishes, a plan began to take shape. David would use his business connections to quietly investigate Charles Blackwood and his associates. Emily, with her insider knowledge, could help identify potential weak points in the organization. It would be dangerous, a delicate balance of gathering evidence without alerting their enemies. But as David watched Emily gently rock Hope to sleep, he knew it was worth the risk. These two deserved a chance at a normal life, free from fear and hiding. That afternoon, as Emily napped with the baby, David made a series of carefully worded phone calls. Old contacts in finance and law enforcement, even a few less savory acquaintances from his early days of building his empire. He was calling in favors, setting the stage for what he knew would be a long and treacherous game. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds of Ravencrest Manor, David stood at the library window. The old house no longer felt like just another investment. It had become a sanctuary, a fortress protecting secrets both old and new. He watched a flock of birds wheel across the darkening sky, their formation a reminder of the fragile balance they were all navigating. One wrong move, one misplaced trust, and everything could come crashing down. But as he turned back to the warm light of the library where Emily sat reading an old book to Hope, David felt a surge of determination. They would find a way through this labyrinth of lies and danger, and when they emerged on the other side, perhaps they would do so not just as survivors, but as a family. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and mounting tension. David divided his time between his normal business operations, now conducted largely via video calls from the manor's newly renovated office, and his clandestine investigation into the Blackwood conspiracy. Emily, for her part, slowly began to emerge from the shell of fear that had encased her for so long. With each passing day, David saw more glimpses of the woman she might have been without the trauma of her past. She was intelligent, with a dry wit that occasionally sparked through her caution. Her love for Hope was fierce and protective, but she was also clearly starved for adult conversation and intellectual stimulation. They fell into an odd sort of domestic routine. David would work late into the night, poring over financial records and following leads. Emily would often join him in the library, Hope sleeping nearby as they pieced together the fragments of her memories with the cold data of bank transfers and shell companies. "I remember overhearing conversations," Emily said one night, her voice low as she cradled a mug of tea. "My uncle and his associates. They would argue about cleaning money, about offshore accounts. I didn't understand it then, but now..." David nodded grimly. "It fits the pattern we're seeing. Your family's legitimate businesses were being used to launder money for a much larger criminal enterprise. The question is, how high does this go?" As the days turned to weeks, the web they uncovered grew ever more complex and disturbing. Charles Blackwood was clearly just one node in a vast network that seemed to touch everything from local politics to international drug cartels. But even as they made progress in their investigation, the strain began to show. Emily was plagued by nightmares, often waking in the night with muffled screams. David found himself jumping at shadows, constantly checking and rechecking the Manor's newly installed security systems. It was during one of these late-night security sweeps that David made a startling discovery. As he reviewed the footage from the cameras overlooking the estate's long, winding driveway, he noticed a car that had driven past several times in the past week. Always at night, always slowing just slightly as it passed the gates. His blood ran cold. Had they been discovered? Was Charles Blackwood or one of his associates already closing in? David's first instinct was to wake Emily, to bundle her and Hope into his car and flee. But he forced himself to think rationally. If they truly had been found, running would only confirm their presence. No, they needed to be smart, to gather more information before making any rash moves. The next morning, over breakfast, David broached the subject carefully. "Emily, I think we may have a problem. There's been a car." He explained what he had seen, watching as the color drained from Emily's face. But to his surprise, she didn't panic. Instead, a steely resolve seemed to settle over her. "We knew this might happen," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We can't run, not now. We're too close to unraveling all of this." David nodded, a surge of admiration for her courage mixing with his concern. "You're right, but we need to be extra cautious. I'm going to upgrade the security again, and I think it's time we considered bringing in some outside help." Emily's brow furrowed. "Who? We can't trust the police and anyone else." "I have a contact," David said carefully. "Someone from my past, before I went fully legitimate. He's not exactly on the right side of the law, but he owes me a favor, and he's very good at staying undetected. If anyone can find out who's watching us without tipping them off, it's him." Emily hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, she nodded. "Do it. But please, be careful. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." The raw emotion in her voice caught David off guard. In the weeks they had spent together, a bond had formed between them, something deeper than just protector and protected. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We're in this together now," he said softly. "Whatever happens, we face it as a team." Later that day, as Emily took Hope for a walk in the overgrown gardens, never straying far from the house, David made a call he had hoped to avoid. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "This better be good, Lanson. I'm retired, remember?" David smiled despite the tension. "Hello to you too, Jack. And since when does someone in your line of work ever really retire?" There was a snort of laughter on the other end. "Fair enough. What's the job?" David outlined the situation, careful to keep the details vague. He knew Jack would fill in the blanks himself. It was what made him so good at what he did. "Sounds like you've stepped in at this time, rich boy," Jack said when David finished. "But yeah, I'll help." Consider us even after this, though." "Agreed," David said, relief evident in his voice. "How soon can you be here?" "I'll be in town by nightfall. Don't wait up. You won't see me, but I'll be watching." The call ended, leaving David with a mix of hope and apprehension. Jack was the best in the business when it came to counter-surveillance, but bringing him in was still a risk. If he was compromised, if he decided the payout from Charles Blackwood's organization was worth more than his debt to David, David pushed the thought aside. They were past the point of playing it completely safe. Sometimes to win the game, you had to be willing to gamble. That night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, David and Emily sat in the library, Hope sleeping peacefully in a bassinet nearby. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "Tell me about your parents," David said softly, partly to distract Emily from their current worries, partly out of genuine curiosity. Emily's eyes grew distant, a sad smile playing at her lips. "They were remarkable people. Brilliant in business, yes, but also so full of life. My father could light up a room just by walking into it. And my mother, she had this quiet strength, this ability to make you feel like you could conquer the world." David listened, entranced, as Emily shared snippets of her childhood, the happy years before everything went wrong. He found himself wishing he could have known the Blackwoods, could have seen Ravencrest Manor in its days of glory. As Emily spoke, the storm outside intensified. Wind howled around the old house, rain lashing against the windows. It was during a particularly loud crash of thunder that they heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a metallic scraping that sent chills down David's spine. Emily froze mid-sentence, her eyes wide with terror. David was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he caught a glimpse of movement near the gate. A dark figure, barely visible in the gloom. "Emily," David said, his voice low and urgent. "Take Hope and go to the safe room we prepared. Now." She didn't argue, scooping up the still sleeping baby and hurrying from the library. David watched them go, his heart pounding. He turned back to the window, straining to see through the storm. The figure was gone, but David knew what he had seen. Someone was on the grounds, someone who didn't belong. The question was it Jack, arriving earlier than expected? Or had their enemies finally made their move? As another flash of lightning illuminated the rain-soaked landscape, David made a decision. He couldn't wait, couldn't risk Emily and Hope's safety on uncertainty. He moved swiftly to his office, unlocking a hidden safe and retrieving the gun he had hoped never to use. The weight of the weapon in his hand was unfamiliar, unsettling. But as he thought of Emily and Hope, huddled in the safe room depending on him for protection, David's resolve hardened. He moved silently through the darkened halls of Ravencrest Manor, every sense on high alert. The storm raged outside, but even over the howling wind, David thought he could hear footsteps, the creak of floorboards that didn't come from his own movement. As he rounded a corner, a shadow detached itself from the wall. David raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a familiar voice cut through the darkness. "Easy there, rich boy. Is that any way to greet an old friend?" David lowered the gun, his heart pounding. "Jack, how the hell did you get in here?" The grizzled ex-operative stepped into a shaft of moonlight streaming through a nearby window. "Your security's good, Lanson, but not that good. We've got work to do if you want to keep your guests safe." Relief washed over David, quickly followed by a renewed sense of urgency. "What did you find?" Jack's expression was grim. "You've got more than one set of eyes on this place. I counted at least 3 separate surveillance teams. Whoever's after your girl, they're not messing around." David's mind raced. Multiple teams meant resources, organization. This was bigger than just Charles Blackwood seeking revenge or trying to tie up loose ends. "We need to move," David said, already heading towards the safe room. "If they're watching this closely, it's only a matter of time before they make a move." Jack fell into step beside him. "Got a plan?" "Working on it," David muttered as they reached the hidden panel that concealed the safe room entrance. He knocked softly, calling out to Emily in a low voice. The door opened to reveal Emily, her face pale but composed, hope cradled protectively against her chest. Her eyes widened at the sight of Jack, but she didn't flinch. "Emily, this is Jack. He's here to help," David explained quickly. "We need to leave now. It's not safe here anymore." Emily nodded, her trust in David evident. "Where will we go?" It was Jack who answered. "I've got a safe house prepped. Off the grid, untraceable. But we need to move fast and smart. They're watching all the obvious exits." David's mind whirled, remembering the layout of the estate from his initial surveys. "The old servants' tunnel," he said suddenly. "It leads from the wine cellar to an exit beyond the garden wall. It's not on any of the modern blueprints." Jack grinned, a predatory expression. "Now you're thinking. Let's move." The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. They gathered only the essentials: documents, some cash, a few changes of clothes for Emily and the baby. David retrieved a hard drive containing all their research on the Blackwood conspiracy. As they made their way to the wine cellar, Jack explained the situation in terse clipped sentences. "Your uncle's got some powerful friends, Miss Blackwood. This goes way beyond a family fortune. We're talking international crime syndicates, corrupt politicians, the works." Emily's face was a mask of determination as she navigated the stairs, hope secure in a sling across her chest. "I always knew it was big, but how do we fight something like that?" "One step at a time," David said, his hand finding the small of Emily's back in a gesture of support. "First we get you and Hope somewhere safe. Then we use what we've uncovered to start dismantling this network." The wine cellar was thick with dust and cobwebs. David and Jack worked together to shift a massive oak rack, revealing the hidden entrance to the tunnel. The passage beyond was dark and foreboding, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Jack produced several flashlights from his pack. "Stay close. Watch your step. This tunnel probably hasn't been used in decades." As they made their way through the narrow passage, David found himself hyper-aware of every sound: the soft whimper of the baby, Emily's measured breathing, the distant rumble of thunder from the storm still raging above. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, they emerged into the rain-soaked night. Jack led them swiftly through a copse of trees to where a nondescript van was hidden. "Your chariot awaits," he said dryly, ushering them inside. As Jack navigated back roads and convoluted routes designed to shake any pursuit, David held Emily close. She was shivering, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I promised to keep you safe, and instead I've put you in more danger." Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "No, David, you've given us a chance. For the first time in years, I feel like there might actually be a future for Hope and me. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for that." The intensity of her gaze, the raw emotion in her voice stirred something deep within David. Without thinking, he leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a soft, tentative kiss. For a moment, the world outside fell away. There was only this: the warmth of Emily's body against his, the quiet sound of Hope's breathing, the promise of something more amidst all the chaos. The moment was broken by Jack's gruff voice from the front seat. "Heads up, lovebirds, we've got company." David turned to see headlights in the distance, gaining on them rapidly. Emily clutched Hope tighter, her face a mixture of fear and resolve. "Hold on," Jack growled, swerving off the main road onto a barely visible track. What followed was a harrowing chase through back roads and forest paths. Jack's driving was a masterclass in evasion, but their pursuers were skilled and determined. Just when it seemed they might shake them, disaster struck. A fallen tree blocked their path, leaving them no choice but to abandon the van and flee on foot. "There's a cabin about half a mile east," Jack said as they scrambled down a steep embankment. "If we can make it there, we've got a chance." They ran through the underbrush, the sound of pursuit growing ever closer. Emily stumbled, nearly falling, but David caught her, supporting her weight as they pressed on. The cabin loomed out of the darkness, a promise of sanctuary. But as they approached, David's heart sank. There, illuminated by the headlights of several vehicles, stood a group of armed men. At their center was a face David recognized from old photographs, older now, lined with cruelty, but unmistakable. Charles Blackwood. "Emily, my dear niece," he called out, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Did you really think you could hide forever?" They were trapped, caught between the approaching pursuers behind and the armed group in front. David's mind raced, searching for a way out, a miracle. But as he looked at Emily, saw the fierce protectiveness in her eyes as she held hope, he knew there would be no easy escape. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Charles stepped forward, his smile predatory. "Come now, let's not make this any more unpleasant than it needs to be. Hand over the child and perhaps we can discuss terms." Emily's voice shook with fury and fear. "Never. I'll die before I let you touch her." David moved in front of Emily, and Hope shielding them with his body. Jack stood beside him, his stance that of a man prepared for one last fight. As the standoff stretched, tension crackling in the air, David made a decision. It was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was the only card they had left to play. "You're right, Charles," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "Let's discuss terms, but not here, not like this. You want to know what we know? What evidence we've gathered? Then let's talk. Just you and me." Charles hesitated, clearly weighing the offer. David pressed on, gambling everything on this one desperate ploy. "You've got us surrounded, we're not going anywhere. So why not hear me out? After all, isn't information what this has always been about?" For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the night breeze and Hope's soft whimpers. Then slowly, Charles nodded. "Very well, Mr. Lanson. You have my attention. But remember, one false move, and this ends badly for all of you." As David stepped forward to face Emily's tormentor, he felt the weight of everything they had been through, everything that hung in the balance. This was it. The moment that would determine not just their fate, but the future of an entire shadowy empire. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would do whatever it took to protect Emily and Hope, even if it cost him everything. The tension in the air was palpable as David faced Charles Blackwood. Behind him, he could sense Emily's fear and Jack's coiled readiness. The armed men surrounding them shifted uneasily, awaiting orders. "You've led quite the chase, Mr. Lanson," Charles said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I must admit, I'm curious to hear what you think you know." David met the older man's gaze steadily. "I know enough to bring your entire operation crashing down. Money laundering, political corruption, international drug trafficking. It's all documented, all ready to be released to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency across the globe." Charles's smile never wavered, but David caught a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Impressive claims, but surely you realize that if such evidence existed, you wouldn't be standing here alive." "Dead man's switch," David countered. "If anything happens to me, Emily, or the child, everything goes public. Your empire burns." It was a bluff, of course. While they had uncovered a significant amount of evidence, they hadn't had time to set up such elaborate fail-safes. But David was counting on Charles's paranoia, on the fear that comes with guarding so many secrets. Charles studied him for a long moment, then chuckled softly. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But what exactly is it you want? Money? Power? Name your price." David shook his head. "This isn't about money. It's about justice. For Emily, for her parents, for everyone your organization has hurt over the years." "Justice?" Charles sneered. "Don't be naive. The world doesn't work that way. There will always be those with power and those without. I simply chose which side to be on." "And what about family?" Emily's voice rang out, clear and strong despite her fear. She stepped forward, hope cradled protectively in her arms. They were your brother, your sister-in-law. How could you do that to them? To me? For the first time, Charles's composure cracked. A flicker of something. Regret, pain, crossed his face before the mask slipped back into place. You don't understand, Emily. Your parents were weak. They would have squandered everything our family built. I did what had to be done to preserve our legacy. Legacy? Emily's voice dripped with contempt. Look around you, uncle. Is this the legacy you wanted? Hiding in the shadows, always looking over your shoulder, sacrificing everything and everyone. For what? Money? Power? Was it worth it? Charles's facade began to crumble. The years of guilt, of paranoia, of ruthlessly suppressing any hint of conscience, it all came crashing down in the face of Emily's words. I never meant for it to go this far, he whispered, suddenly looking old and defeated. It was supposed to be simple, take control, expand our influence, but then one compromise led to another, and before I knew it, David seized the moment. It's not too late to make things right, Charles. Turn yourself in. Testify against your associates. Help us bring down this entire corrupt system. For a tense moment, the night air hummed with possibility. David could see the conflict raging behind Charles's eyes. Years of ambition and callousness warring with a long-buried sense of decency. But then, in an instant, everything changed. A shot rang out, shattering the tableau. Charles stumbled, a look of shock on his face as a crimson stain blossomed on his chest. More gunfire erupted and chaos descended. "Get down!" Jack roared, tackling David and Emily to the ground. Hope wailed in terror as bullets whizzed overhead. Through the confusion, David caught glimpses of a new group of armed individuals engaged in a firefight with Charles's men. Friend or foe, he couldn't tell, but he knew they had to move. "The cabin!" he shouted to Jack over the din. "It's our only chance." Keeping low, they half crawled, half ran towards the structure. David shielded Emily and Hope with his body, praying that the wooden walls would provide some protection from the hail of bullets. They burst through the door, Jack quickly barricading it behind them. The cabin was sparse. A few pieces of rustic furniture, a fireplace, and not much else. But it was shelter, however temporary. "What's happening out there?" Emily gasped, trying to calm the sobbing Hope. Jack peered through a gap in the window shutters. "Looks like a third party crashed the party. Rival organization, maybe? Or could be law enforcement finally caught up." David's mind raced. This chaos could be their opportunity to escape, but it could just as easily get them killed. They needed a plan. "Jack, is there another way out of here?" he asked urgently. The ex-operative nodded. "There's a trap door in the floor, leads to a root cellar. Might be able to tunnel our way out from there." As Jack and David worked to locate and open the hidden exit, Emily suddenly gasped. "David, look." He turned to see her holding up a dusty photograph she'd found on a shelf. It showed a much younger Charles Blackwood, smiling genuinely, his arm around a man who could only be Emily's father. "They were close once," Emily said, softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Before greed and jealousy poisoned everything." The moment of reflection was shattered by a splintering crash. Someone was breaking down the door. Jack had the trapdoor open in an instant. "Go," he urged. "I'll hold them off, buy you some time." David hesitated. "Jack, no. This is what you're paying me for, rich boy," Jack said with a grim smile. "Now get her and that baby out of here. Go." With a final nod of gratitude, David helped Emily and Hope down into the dark space beneath the cabin. The last thing he saw before pulling the trapdoor shut was Jack taking up a defensive position, gun at the ready. The root cellar was dank and claustrophobic, lit only by the weak beam of David's phone flashlight. They could hear muffled shouts and gunfire from above, but it was impossible to tell what was happening. "This way," David whispered, guiding Emily towards what he hoped was an exit tunnel. "We need to put as much distance between us and that cabin as possible." They crawled through the narrow earthen passage, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. Hope, miraculously, had fallen into an exhausted sleep, perhaps sensing the need for quiet. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they emerged into the cool night air. They were in a small clearing, the sounds of the firefight now distant. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. David took a deep breath, trying to center himself. "We keep moving. Find a road, flag down help if we can. We've got the evidence on this drive. It's our best chance at ending this once and for all." As they set off through the dark forest, David's mind whirled with possibilities. Had Charles survived the shooting? Was Jack still alive? And who were the new players that had interrupted their confrontation? One thing was clear: their ordeal was far from over. But as he looked at Emily, saw the determination in her eyes as she cradled her sleeping daughter, David felt a surge of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The truth would come out. Justice would be served, and perhaps, just perhaps, they could build a future free from the shadows of the past. The first hints of dawn were breaking on the horizon as they finally reached a deserted highway. In the distance, they could hear the wail of approaching sirens. Whether they heralded salvation or a new set of dangers remained to be seen. Emily turned to David, her face etched with exhaustion but also a fierce resolve. "Whatever happens next," she said softly, "thank you for believing in me, for giving hope and me a chance." David took her free hand in his, squeezing it gently. "We're in this together now," he said, "no matter what." As the flashing lights drew nearer, they stood side by side, ready to face whatever the new day might bring. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and challenges. But for the first time in years, Emily allowed herself to feel something she had almost forgotten: hope. In the growing light, David, Emily, and little Hope stood as a family, forged in adversity, bound by love and a shared determination to see justice done. The final chapter of their story was yet to be written, but one thing was certain: they would write it together.